Good morning. I'm going to continue with my series on the World Championships. They're now working our way backwards. We come to the World Championship between uh, Magnus Carlsen, who here has the black pieces, and Fabiano Caruana. This is game number 1, and as you can see, according to the engine, it's minus 2.4 to Magnus, but the move Queen to G1 is very inhuman and really a long, complicated idea where you give up the 2 pawns, which seem to be cramping the king side, and take some advantages on the other side, eventually winning the pawns on the other side. Not the kind of thing a person is going to spot in any circumstances. And Carlsen played bishop takes c3, and the position ebbed out into a long and complicated draw. I think they played 100 and something moves. He didn't. He always had this advantage in the game, this around 2 advantage, but it never increased. It never became a winning advantage. He wasn't really in a position to do much with it. So that was game number 1, and then I'll just look at. Nope, sorry. I'll just look at game number 3 from this. Yeah, and in this position, the game number 6 came down to this position. Caruana has the. Oh, sorry, there's a pawn missing. Should be a pawn on f6. I was messing about trying to find the problem, the position myself, but there's a pawn on f6, and this position is actually a draw. But the game was another very long endgame draw. But there came a point in time in this game as well where Caruana suddenly, according to Sese, had mate in 38 moves. Really long, complicated, almost impossible to see sequence of restricting white, which would lead to a win eventually. But it wasn't seen, and the game petered out into a draw. You know, I was thinking of setting up the position and saying find the mate in 38 moves here, but thought I was taking it a bit too far. But one really interesting thing about this is uh, in the interview after the first game, Carlsen had difficulty believing that the engine line was actually winning, but fair enough. But when they talked about this game, right after the game, within a couple of minutes of the game finishing, one of the commentators said to Magnus that suddenly showed up mate in 38, and Carlsen named the correct move number. Oh yeah, I said, oh yeah, of course. Named the correct move number, the correct move that should have been played, and outlined the scheme for producing that mate in 38. Just incredibly quick thinking and understanding the position, which he didn't show in his long thinking. But the mate in 38, we don't find mate in 38. The idea wasn't completely as engine-like as the idea in the first game, but it was so long and complicated that you can't expect people to be finding these kind of sequences after 5 hours of playing. So those were the only 2 chances in the classical match, and the match ended up being a draw. The first time that there had been no wins in the classical part of the Chess World Championship. So it was all decided in the rapid play, 4 rapid play games afterwards. And I thought I would go through the first of the rapid play games here. Uh, there was in the 12th game, some people were a bit like Carlsen had a chance to press. He certainly couldn't have lost the 12th game, but he had a chance to possibly press for a win in the 12th game, but he didn't. He just accepted a draw quickly because he knew he was better in rapid chess than Caruana. A very pragmatic decision. So this is the first rapid game. This World Championship was played in London in 2018. And Caruana here has the white pieces, and he plays the English c4. E5, boot move, King's English variation. I'll get rid of the analysis, sorry. Makes it into a kind of a reverse Sicilian. Knight comes to where it's as if white is playing Sicilian, not black. It says indeed reverse Sicilian. So the knights come out, and the bishop comes to g3. Pawn comes to g3 to allow the bishop here in Keto. And this is rather similar to Rossolimo Nechmedinov attack, but obviously black's attacking the knight, not white. But no, it goes completely back to an English system. This is the Karls Bremen Smyslov system. Karls and Smyslov were well-known theorists in the English opening. The reason it's called a Bremen system, I might have mentioned before that the English opening was originally played by German players at the Baden-Baden tournament with great success, but then the English players adopted it and had even greater success. That's why it became known as the English opening, but in Germany it's still known as the Bremen opening. I believe that it's not so far from Bremen to Baden-Baden. Yeah, anyway, that's just a historical note. I love my little historical notes. So, castles. King's knight comes to e2, so that he's got a defender for this pawn regardless. So it's not worth snatching off the knight now to try and get this pawn. The pawn comes to c6, he's ready to make an attack against the centre. The bishop comes to g2, so that if he takes with the pawn. He then takes with the pawn, and the knight and bishop threat. So making it difficult to play d5. You see, one of the points here is that white hasn't yet committed to d3, and he doesn't play d3 before he castles, so that the knight is never pinned. I think this is one of the features of this Karls Bremen Smyslov system in the English opening. Anyway. So, Caruana plays a6. Maybe he's looking at playing the pawn here. Maybe he's looking at playing the queen out here to increase the pressure on the knight. And Carlsen castles. The pawn comes to b5, so he's breaking down the structure on the queen side. Yeah, sensible enough approach. The pawn comes to d4. He's breaking down the structure in the centre, so he's saying, if you take this, I'll take this. But of course, it looks like black can temporarily win a pawn. Pawn takes, and knight takes, and then pawn takes. But he doesn't have to take with the knight. He can take with the queen. So he plays d6. And the question is put to the bishop. And now we are getting nearer to it being a sacrifice of this pawn. And he takes with the bishop, and Carlsen takes with the knight. So this pawn is now up for grabs. But of course, if he takes, then the queen can come to a4 to get the pawn back. That's his idea. So he plays B takes d4, c4, takes the pawn here. He's willing to swap off queens here, possibly. But whatever, when he takes this pawn back, no, queen to a4 is an even more powerful move because it attacks two pawns which are both isolated. So, yep. Takes back. But he doesn't do that. He plays e4. You know, knight to a4. He's got a different plan for getting back that pawn. Bishop t6. And the queens are swapped off. And the bishop comes here. You can see now that he's looking at playing rook here and knight here to get this pawn back. But also, Caruana's pawn structure is significantly worse than Carlsen's pawn structure in this game, and that's part of his idea that I'm playing against your poor pawn structure here. I don't care so much about that pawn. I care more about the pawn structure. So he plays f3 to support the e pawn. It doesn't matter so much about opening this diagonal because the only dark squared bishop is Carlsen's dark squared bishop. Yeah, and the rook attacks the pawn on b2 and takes control of the only of one of the half open files. Of course, Carlsen's not going to put a rook behind it, apart from the fact that that the bishop might at some point in time be able to attack the rook there. You're just putting your rook in a pinned position, and it's not worth it. He's suggesting a swap of prisoners. He's saying, you take mine, I'll take yours. And not only that, when he takes his, then this weak pawn soon falls, and this weak pawn soon falls, and the whole queen side will be eliminated. And Carlsen will be left with the two bishops against the knight and bishop. So, yeah, that's his idea with rook a8 c1. Rook comes to b3 to threaten the bishop. So the rook comes to a good central file and supports the bishop at the same time, which makes sense. The knight comes to f8. He might be looking at coming here, or here, and here. Probably heading for the b5 square, and maybe at some point in the future heading for the d4 square. If he gets a knight well supported on d4, he'll be in a fantastic position. So now creates another threat on the pawn on c4. That pawn was always doomed. And the knight comes to d6 to defend the pawn on c4. Maybe that pawn wasn't always doomed. But yeah, it's still not long for this world. Or long. It's a very difficult to defend pawn, and it costs more than it's worth to defend. That's the idea behind Carlsen's play. So he attacks the knight, the defender of the pawn. But when the knight moves, the knight behind will be pinned. Or if this knight moves so that the rook defends, then this knight will be pinned to the rook. So yeah, a great idea to take control of the open file. So knight comes to b5 so that it's this knight which is pinned. And also it stops it and being able to play this knight and attack this pawn. So knight comes to b5, yeah, and the knight comes to c5, attacking another weak pawn and attacking the bishop at the same time, so that he's threatening to swap the knight for the bishop and play with pure 2 bishops against 2 knights against this really weakened pawn structure. Yeah, Caruana can take the pawn on b3, but then yeah, the double c pawns are still very weak, and Carlsen just thinks, yeah, okay, doesn't matter. So he takes the pawn on b2, and he takes the pawn on e6, and now another set of doubled and isolated pawns. So you've got 2 sets of doubled isolated pawns and an isolated pawn. And not just that, but now suddenly the pawn on c4 is no longer defended, and Carlsen attacks at the same time the doubled isolated pawn on e6. This one is a bit easier to defend. It can be defended by the king, amongst other things. But he plays knight to d4 to defend the pawn. This gives Carlsen the opportunity to swap for the knight, play bishop takes knight, knight takes, pawn takes, and rook takes knight, and then, you know, get a pawn up. Sorry, it's 2, 4, 6 against 5. Get down to level pawns again. But you know, is it necessarily any better? Is it necessarily a position that can be won? Well, let's see. Because he plays that, and he plays bishop, but of course Carlsen doesn't have to play rook takes pawn. He can take this pawn. Bishop takes e6, check, and the king comes to f8, and the pawns are still very weak for Caruana. And the rook takes the pawn on d4, and now suddenly Carlsen's a pawn up 5 against 4. Alright, he's not got the 2 bishops anymore, but he's still got a bishop and a knight in what is clearly an endgame. In the endgame, bishops are superior to knights. Why? Because, you know, and if you put the knight here, put the bishop here, it's in theory stopping this pawn from being able to queen, and stopping a pawn on the c file from being able to queen. That knight is only ever going to be able to stop one. It's, you know, for a knight to go so many squares is going to take all day. They're much slower, and they cover distance much worse. So yeah, so the king comes to e7 to attack the bishop, and Carlsen recognizes that this is a one end game because his passed pawn on e4 is much stronger than the passed pawn to Caruana on c6. So he takes with check, and of course he has no choice but to take back. Takes and takes, and now, yeah, he has a fantastic pass pawn, which his rook is already behind. Rook to d3 looks like the ideal place for that rook, so that it's behind the pawn and it's supporting all these pawns. And doesn't matter that the pawn is on the rook is on the 7th, restraining the king, because it's going to have to come back and help to stop this pawn anyway, or these pawns, which will soon become an avalanche of kingside pawns. But he gives up that ideal square. He knows what he's doing, luckily. And the king comes to e6. And so maybe he's thinking about advancing this pawn, attacking this pawn. Who knows? And he comes to f4 as. Now, any check on the 6th rank will force the king back to the 7th rank, and restrain the king. And when the Caruana king becomes as restricted as the Carlsen king, then the far superior pawn structure and the extra pawn will count. If there's anybody who can make a superior pawn structure and an extra pawn count, it's our friend Mr. Carlsen. Passed pawns need to be pushed, so he pushes it. The rook comes to d5, it's threatening the pawn. The rook can come here to defend the pawn, but then you're putting the rook in a very passive position, and that's great. And if the pawn moves, you might think, oh well, the pawn can move and he can support here, but then Carlsen gets the ideal situation, whereas the rook behind the passed pawn, the Tarrasch rule, so that he's got all the squares on the file to use as the pawn advances. So yeah, really nice, precise stuff. So rook comes to c2, a slightly less passive position from which to defend the pawn on c4, c5. But h4, he's just going to take up a bit more space on the king side and make it so that if Caruana plays rook to c3 to attack these two pawns, then he'll defend this pawn with the king and say, you take mine, I'll take yours, and I'm happy with that. And of course he would be happy with that situation. So the pawn moves forward and Carlsen plays a check first instead of just going right behind the pawn whilst he's still controlling this square. He plays the check so that it's hard for the king to come to annoy the rook. So yeah, again a very smart move by Carlsen. Very aware of the possibility. So the king's got to come to f6 and the rook comes to c5, follows the Tarrasch rule and gets the rook behind the passed pawn. And now he's also threatening g4, g5 check, and then the king is really restrained. And the rook can then come to f7 and put the Caruana king on the back rank. And yeah, one of these pawns is going to queen. That's his idea. So yeah, rook to c5, ideal position for the pawn in the endgame. h5, good move by Caruana. Restrains this pawn, and in that way restrains this pawn from playing here, and in that way also restrains this pawn. One pawn restraining two. It's a reasonably good idea by Caruana. Well, it's a good idea. He's not just rolling over, isn't Caruana? He's doing his best to fight over it. Where are we? 33. h5, yeah? Yeah, the king comes to f1. It's not a problem with wandering over here and scaring away the rook. And if the rook comes for these pawns, fine. Take these pawns. I'll take this pawn. Then I'll say here, check. And if you come here, I come here, check. And chase the king away from there. And then I can get the rook on here. And, might not be the ideal position, but, it's a winnable position. Carlsen knows what he's doing, unlike me. I think as amateurs, one of the things we're all worst at is the end game. So, Caruana attacks two pawns. He will be winning a pawn. On the next move, if he so wishes. The king comes to g2. So, proposes an exchange of prisoners. And the pawn's taken, and the rook is taken, and the king comes to e5. Yeah, it's just this. Is this a bit dodgy for Carlsen? Is Caruana making a comeback in this game? No, he isn't at all. Carlsen knows exactly what he's doing here. So the king comes to e5. Yeah, he might well be threatening to win this pawn. But it's going to, if he does that, it's going to cost him this pawn. But what about then this pawn? Yeah, we'll see. Sorry. He has a very clever, accurate way of finishing this off. But it is just technique. He is a pawn up. He does have a much better position, and he does have just one island of pawns at the minute, which needs to be defended. So, yeah. So, king comes to e5, and Carlsen says, yeah, take that. I'll take this. I'll come behind this. I might even have time to take this, and then come behind this. You're not going to be getting a queen. So, yeah, that's his clever plan to defend the e-pawn. He's not going to. And the king takes. And the king comes to, the rook comes to e7 first check. Why not just take? I don't know. Oh, it's so that when he takes, he's immediately threatening to play rook here check and win this pawn. That's why. So he plays check first. The pawn is taken, and so now they've got exactly even pawns. What is Carlsen playing at? Yeah, but he knows that this pawn is undefendable, and they can get behind this pawn at almost any time, and that again it's still with pawns on two sides. If there had been pawns on one side of the board, this position would be a draw. But with pawns on both sides of the board, this position is a win. And this Carlsen knows this. Carlsen has flawless endgame technique when he plays at his best. It's the World Championship. It's rapid. His endgame technique is going to be absolutely flawless, of course. So the king comes to f6 to attack the rook. The rook comes to g5. Pawn comes to a5. I think even we can see the writing on the wall here. The rook comes to a1. King comes to f3. He's planning on bringing his king nearer and restraining the black king further and further. Pawn comes to sorry, he played pawn here first. He did. Yeah, played a4 first, did Caruana. And then the rook comes to a5 and it's behind the pawn, Tarrasch rule. And this rook behind the pawn restrains the black king as well, and these two pawns won't be stoppable. And as long as he doesn't get in a situation where the rook, the pawn's on the second, and the rook can say check and not be taken, then it get a pawn, or in a position where the rook can get a check behind the king here, for example, and win the rook, which picks up the pawn on a2, then there's no way for Caruana to win this, and Carlsen isn't going to make either of those mistakes. So the rook comes to a1. Yeah, he's got to try something. The pawn comes to f3. Yeah, the king comes to f3. No, if he gets the pawn to a7, then check here. Check, king's going to move, new queen. King's going to move, new queen, rook takes. But actually, it isn't even guaranteed that the rook will win against these two pawns, but it will definitely at least draw against the two pawns. So, you know. Anyway, he plays rook to a1, that's his threat. Pawn comes to h5. Oh, sorry, the king comes to f3. Pawn comes to a3. Rook comes to a6 check. Yeah, you can come forward if you will, but then if you come forward, then this pawn is just going to be getting away. And the good thing is now that when he plays the check here, if he plays pawn to h5, then he can defend it with the rook as well as with the pawn. But yeah, so the rook comes to a6 and says check, and the king has to go to g7 to be in a position to possibly stop these pawns. And now the king comes to g2, and there's no way to get either the rook revealing a check here, plan for to win the pawn, or the get the pawn to a2 and say check on the second rank to win the rook, which takes the pawn. Neither of those two possibilities are now open to Caruana. So even I can begin to see that this is just a matter of pushing the pawns. So the rook comes to a2 check, the king comes to h3. The king can also help with the job of restraining these pawns, the king. In fact, the king can come to here, and we can have a classic king and rook mate as well. You know, all those dangers are open to him. So the rook comes back to a1. Now again he's threatened to play a7 and then rook here check and get a new queen. If Carlsen is careless enough to just push the pawn. But he pushes the pawn, the other pawn. So, and the king comes to h7, and now he pushes the g pawn. And if the pawn comes to here, the king comes to the second rank. So that idea won't work. It keeps himself on the g2 square. Yeah, and Caruana is slowly but surely running out of moves. The king now comes to g4. Well, wait a minute, isn't there something in this idea? It is, but he can shelter from all checks behind the pawn here, where he's in a position to then play rook to a7 and force the king further back and put Caruana in a mating net. So, not a problem. a2. He's going to act now. He's going to come to g5 now. Otherwise, it's just going to be a mating net. King comes to f7. Pawn comes to h6. Rook comes to b1. And Carlsen, and the most typically Carlsen thing that you're ever going to see. One of the great things about Magnus Carlsen, when he's got a winning position, he doesn't just bam, slam, go and play the attack he's got immediately. He puts everything in its best possible place first, or in this case, puts everything in its worst possible place first, because he plays a7 check before taking the pawn, and in order to be in a position to to be able to think of stopping the pawns, the king has to come to g7, g8, sorry, the worst possible square for the king. So then he takes the pawn, and now he's got two passed pawns against nothing. There's not, but you know, he doesn't just throw it all away. Sorry, oh, played that to the wrong square. He takes. Yeah, plays rook to b5 check, king to b6. He plays rook to g6, b6 check, and the king comes here. And now he's in a position to push the pawn, get the king in the mating net. And yeah, that's enough for Caruana. Carlsen's king is safe, his king isn't, and his king is very, very restrained. And his rook is fairly passive, trying to stop these passed pawns, stop the impossible task of stopping these passed pawns. And so, in the rapid play match, Carlsen took the lead 1-0. Yeah. Yeah, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to my videos. Thanks. Bye.